When an avoidant meets you, something very specific happens inside their nervous system, and most people completely misunderstand it. They assume attraction is simple, that if someone feels drawn to you, they should naturally move closer. But for an avoidant, attraction doesn't register as safety. It registers as activation. Your presence doesn't just feel exciting, it feels destabilizing. You don't quietly enter their emotional world, you turn the lights on. Avoidant attachment is built around control. Control of distance, control of exposure, control of emotional dependence. And here's the paradox: the more emotionally grounded, authentic, and present you are, the harder it becomes for them to maintain that control. You don't chase them, yet you're deeply available. You don't overwhelm them, yet you're emotionally awake. That combination is rare, and for an avoidant, it's threatening in a way that feels impossible to explain. Because you don't just trigger desire, you trigger memory. Old emotional imprints they've buried under independence, logic, or self-sufficiency start rising to the surface. They may not consciously think of their childhood or past relationships, but their body remembers. Their nervous system recognizes something familiar and unfinished. And that's where the fear begins. Not fear of you, but fear of what being close to you would require them to confront. You see, avoidants don't experience intimacy as warmth first. They experience it as loss of autonomy, as the risk of being needed, as the risk of being seen. When you walk into their life with emotional clarity and consistency, you represent connection without chaos. And that's the most destabilizing thing of all. Chaos they understand. Inconsistency they can manage. But calm presence, emotional coherence, that bypasses their defenses. This is why their reactions often seem contradictory. One moment they're intensely drawn to you, curious, engaged, even vulnerable in flashes. The next moment they pull back, grow cold, or disappear. It's not manipulation, it's internal conflict. Desire and threat are firing at the same time. Their attachment system is saying, move closer, while their survival system is saying, this is dangerous. And what makes you different, what makes you unforgettable, is that you don't fit into their usual categories. You're not someone they can keep at arm's length emotionally. You don't play power games. You don't require them to perform. You simply are. And that presence removes the illusion that they can stay untouched while still feeling connected. With you, they sense that real closeness is possible, and that terrifies them more than loneliness ever could. Philosophically, this is where meaning enters the picture. Human beings are wired to grow at the edge of their comfort. But avoidants have learned to equate comfort with safety and growth with danger. You stand at that edge for them, not as pressure, but as invitation. An invitation is harder to resist than force, because deep down they know you're not asking them to lose themselves. You're revealing the parts of themselves they've been avoiding. That's why they may idealize you internally while distancing externally. Why they think about you more when you're gone than when you're present. Your energy disrupts their emotional equilibrium. You represent a version of connection that doesn't demand collapse or control, but it does demand honesty. And honesty for an avoidant feels like standing without armor. Understand this clearly: their fear is not a reflection of your intensity being too much. It's a reflection of your integration being unfamiliar. You're emotionally aligned. Your words match your actions. Your presence is stable. And that stability removes the excuses they've relied on to stay disconnected. With you, they can't blame drama, chaos, or timing. They have to face themselves. And when someone activates both longing and fear in another person, they leave a mark. Even if the avoidant pulls away, even if they rationalize the distance, even if they convince themselves they're better off alone, the nervous system doesn't forget what it felt like to be both seen and safe at the same time. That memory lingers. So if you've ever wondered why their withdrawal felt sudden, confusing, or disproportionate to what was happening on the surface, this is why. You didn't do anything wrong. You did something rare. You activated desire and threat simultaneously. You became the mirror that showed them what connection could be and what it would cost them to avoid it. And here's the truth to carry with you. When someone feels both drawn to you and afraid of you, it's because you matter at a level they weren't prepared to face. There's a crucial difference between being admired and being seen, and for an avoidant, that difference changes everything. Admiration feels safe. It keeps things on the surface. It allows them to receive validation without exposure. But being seen, truly seen, penetrates the structures they've spent a lifetime building to stay emotionally protected. And that's where your impact on them becomes undeniable. When you connect with an avoidant, you don't just respond to what they show you. You notice what they don't say. You sense shifts in energy. You feel when something is off, even if their words sound fine. This level of perception isn't intrusive, it's intuitive. And for someone who has learned to survive by keeping their inner world private, that intuition feels almost threatening, not because it's wrong, but because it's accurate. Avoidants often pride themselves on self-sufficiency. They define strength as emotional containment, needing less, feeling less, depending on no one. Over time, this identity becomes rigid. It's not just how they relate, it's who they believe they are. When you come into their life and reflect back emotional truths they haven't spoken out loud, you challenge that identity. You show them that independence isn't the same as invulnerability. And here's the unsettling part for them. You do it without interrogation. You're not demanding explanations. You're not forcing confessions. Your awareness is quiet, calm, and grounded. You simply respond in ways that reveal you understand more than they expected. That's what makes it disarming. They can't defend against something that isn't attacking them. Psychologically, being seen activates shame before it activates love. Shame isn't about wrongdoing, it's about exposure. It's the feeling of, if you really know me, will I still be acceptable? Avoidants carry this question deeply, even if they never articulate it. When you see past their competence, their charm, or their emotional restraint, you touch the part of them that worries they are only valued for what they don't need. This is why moments of emotional closeness with an avoidant can feel profound, and then suddenly followed by distance. In those moments, they feel relief, resonance, even warmth. But afterward, their system reinterprets the experience as risk. They think, they know me now, and knowledge in their internal logic equals vulnerability. Vulnerability equals danger. Philosophically, this speaks to a deeper human fear, the fear of being known without control. Most people curate how they're perceived. Avoidants take that to an extreme. They've learned that if they manage the narrative, they manage the pain. You disrupt that strategy not by exposing them, but by accepting what you see. And acceptance is far more destabilizing than criticism. Criticism confirms their defenses. Acceptance bypasses them. This is why they may pull away after moments where nothing went wrong. The conversation was good, the connection felt natural, the silence was comfortable, and yet something inside them tightens, because comfort without performance is unfamiliar territory. Being valued for who they are, rather than how little they need, creates an identity crisis they don't know how to resolve. You also represent a mirror they can't easily distort. With others, they can remain vague, emotionally distant, or undefined. With you, clarity emerges naturally. You respond to their emotional state, not just their behavior. You remember what matters to them. You connect patterns, and that reflection forces them to confront a truth they've avoided. That emotional depth doesn't weaken them. It reveals them. This is why they may oscillate between opening up and shutting down, between sharing something real and then minimizing it later. They're testing the waters. Can they be seen and still remain in control? Can they be known without being consumed? And when they don't yet trust the answer, they retreat. Not because you ask too much, but because you understood too well. If you've ever felt like you were punished for your emotional intelligence in that dynamic, this is why. Your attunement created intimacy without effort. And intimacy for an avoidant is something that's supposed to be earned slowly, cautiously, with walls intact. You made it feel natural. And that naturalness exposed how unnecessary those walls might be. So when they distance themselves, don't assume your perception was a mistake. Don't dull your awareness. Don't shrink your insight. What you offered was rare, the experience of being seen without being judged. And even if they couldn't stay present with it, that experience doesn't disappear from their nervous system. Because once someone has been seen clearly and accepted fully, they can never go back to believing invisibility is safety. What makes you especially powerful in the life of an avoidant is not just who you are in the present, but what you represent in their imagination. You don't arrive as a fleeting experience or a temporary distraction. You arrive as possibility. And for someone with an avoidant attachment style, possibility is far more frightening than loss. Avoidants often live in a split internal world. On one side, there is the fantasy of deep connection, the idea of being truly known, supported, chosen, and emotionally safe with another person. On the other side, there is a long history of learning that closeness comes with cost, pressure, expectation, disappointment, or emotional overwhelm. They cope with this split by keeping desire alive in theory while avoiding it in practice. Wanting becomes safe only when it stays hypothetical. Then you appear, and suddenly the fantasy no longer lives in the abstract. It has a face, a voice, a presence. With you, connection doesn't feel chaotic or dramatic. It feels stable. It feels mutual. It feels like something that could actually last. And that's the moment their internal alarm system goes off, not because the connection is wrong, but because it's real. You symbolize the relationship they secretly want but don't believe they can sustain, not because they doubt you, but because they doubt themselves. They worry about their capacity to stay emotionally engaged, to meet needs consistently, to remain present when intimacy deepens. You represent a level of relational integrity that exposes the gap between who they are and who they believe they would need to be to keep you. This is where the push-pull pattern intensifies. When they move closer, they feel alive, expanded, connected, but almost immediately that closeness translates into an unspoken question, can I maintain this? And when the answer feels uncertain, retreat becomes their way of regaining psychological safety. Distance lowers the standard. It reduces expectation. It restores the familiar sense of control. Philosophically, this reflects a core human struggle, the tension between longing and self-trust. Avoidants long deeply, but they lack confidence in their ability to stay open over time. They've learned that dependence equals danger, and so they interpret commitment not as devotion, but as a trap. When you embody a relationship that would require emotional consistency rather than occasional intensity, you trigger this fear at its root. That's why they may idealize you internally while simultaneously creating space externally. In their mind, you become the what if, the person they could imagine a future with but don't feel equipped to fully choose. They don't devalue you, they elevate you. And elevation makes avoidance feel justified, even noble. They deserve more than I can give, becomes a way of protecting themselves from the shame of not feeling ready. You also challenge a belief they rarely examine, that independence and intimacy are mutually exclusive. With you, they experience closeness without losing themselves. You don't engulf them. You don't demand emotional performance. You simply show up. And that subtle ease destabilizes the narrative they've relied on to stay detached. It suggests that intimacy doesn't have to be exhausting, that maybe the problem isn't connection, but avoidance. This realization is unsettling, because if the relationship feels healthy, then the reason for pulling away can no longer be blamed on circumstance, timing, or incompatibility. It points inward. It asks them to confront the limits of their emotional availability. And facing limits is painful for someone whose identity is built around competence and control. So instead of leaning into growth, they often choose distance. Not because distance feels good, but because it feels manageable. They return to the comfort of autonomy, even if it comes with loneliness. They tell themselves they're not ready, that they need space, that now isn't the right time. These explanations aren't lies, they're survival strategies. If you've ever felt like you were standing at the threshold of something meaningful, only to watch them step back, understand this. You didn't imagine that depth. You didn't misread the potential. You were seeing clearly. You were simply ahead of them in emotional readiness. And here's the part that lingers long after separation. Once an avoidant has experienced a relationship that felt both deep and stable, they can't fully erase it. Other connections may feel easier, but they won't feel the same. The comparison happens quietly, often unconsciously. You become the reference point, the proof that the kind of relationship they want is possible, even if they weren't able to stay in it. So don't interpret their withdrawal as a verdict on your worth. It's a reflection of the distance between their desire and their capacity. You represented something meaningful, something real, something they weren't prepared to sustain. And the truth is this: when someone steps away from a relationship, not because it's broken, but because it's still intact, you weren't a passing chapter, you were a turning point. One of the most misunderstood dynamics with avoidant attachment is this idea of control. People assume avoidants want power over others, but that's not quite accurate. What they want is regulation. They've learned to regulate their emotions by regulating distance. If they can decide how close someone gets, they can decide how much they have to feel. And for a long time, that strategy works, until they meet someone whose emotional stability can't be managed through distance alone. That's where you come in. Your emotional stability disrupts their entire attachment strategy. You don't panic when they pull back. You don't chase for reassurance. You don't collapse into anxiety or escalate into drama. You stay centered. You remain consistent. And paradoxically, that calm does not soothe them. It unsettles them because their system is wired to respond to emotional volatility, not emotional coherence. Avoidants are accustomed to being the more grounded one in the dynamic. They expect the other person to want more, feel more, need more. That asymmetry gives them leverage. It reassures them that they're safe from engulfment. But when you show up as emotionally self-regulated, able to connect deeply without losing yourself, you remove that leverage. Suddenly, they're no longer in the familiar role of the detached one. The playing field levels, and that feels like a loss of control. Here's the subtle shift that happens internally when you don't react the way they expect. Their distancing stops working the way it used to. Silence doesn't provoke anxiety. Space doesn't create pursuit. Withdrawal doesn't give them relief. It creates curiosity. They start to wonder why you're not destabilized, why you're still grounded, why you haven't lost your sense of self. And that curiosity quietly turns into attachment. Psychologically, this is because your nervous system isn't feeding into theirs. You're co-regulating without trying to. Your calm presence offers safety without submission. And for an avoidant, that's deeply confusing. They've learned to equate safety with autonomy and danger with emotional dependence. You blur that line, you show them that closeness doesn't have to cost control, and control doesn't have to mean disconnection. This is why avoidants often feel more attached to people who don't chase them. Not because they enjoy distance, but because distance loses its power when it doesn't provoke fear. When you hold your boundaries without anger, without withdrawal, without over-explaining, you signal something rare, self-trust. And self-trust is magnetic. It forces them to engage emotionally rather than manage proximity. There's also a philosophical dimension here. Control is an attempt to avoid uncertainty. But intimacy is inherently uncertain. You cannot love without risk. Avoidants try to reduce that risk by staying one step removed. Your emotional stability exposes the futility of that approach. You don't eliminate uncertainty, you tolerate IT. You remain open without needing guarantees, and that challenges their core belief that safety comes from distance rather than resilience. As a result, they may feel strangely powerless around you. Not in a threatening way, but in a disorienting one. Their usual tools, pulling away, becoming vague, delaying, don't produce the expected results. You don't become smaller, you don't try to prove your worth, you don't negotiate for closeness, and that forces them to confront something uncomfortable. If connection fades, it won't be because you chase them away. It will be because they chose not to show up. This realization often increases their internal conflict. They may feel more drawn to you while simultaneously feeling exposed. Because with you, avoidance doesn't protect them from attachment, it intensifies it. The less reactive you are, the more they have to feel their own emotions without distraction. And that's something they've spent years avoiding. So if at times they seem unsettled by your calm, understand what's really happening. You're not being distant. You're not being cold. You're being integrated. Your boundaries are clear, your presence is steady, and your emotional life doesn't revolve around their behavior. That independence within connection is what destabilizes their control-based strategy. And here's the quiet truth that often goes unspoken. People who rely on control to feel safe are most affected by those who don't need it. You become a mirror of emotion. Maturity they can't manipulate, outrun, or ignore. And when someone can no longer control closeness through distance, they're forced to face the one thing avoidance was designed to escape: authentic emotional engagement. Of the clearest signs that you matter to an avoidant far more than they were ever able to admit is the way you quietly rearrange their internal hierarchy. Avoidants don't attach easily, and they don't integrate people deeply into their emotional world. Most relationships are compartmentalized, kept in neat psychological boxes that prevent any one person from becoming too central. But every so often, someone slips past that structure. And when that happens, it changes everything. You weren't just another connection. You became a reference point. Avoidants often evaluate relationships through comparison, even if they're not consciously aware of it. They notice how they feel around different people, how much effort is required, how much emotional energy is drained or preserved. With most people, the answer is simple: maintain distance, maintain balance, maintain control. But with you, something disrupted that equation. You didn't require emotional shutdown for them to feel safe. You didn't force them into performance or withdrawal. You fit into their life in a way that felt unusually natural. And that naturalness is exactly what elevated you. In their internal ranking system, where safety, ease, and autonomy usually outweigh emotional depth, you occupy. Add multiple categories at once. You were stimulating without being overwhelming, present without being invasive, grounded without being cold. That combination is rare, and their nervous system noticed it long before their logic did. This is why, even after distance or separation, you remain unusually vivid in their mind. You're not remembered as a mistake or a lesson. You're remembered as an exception. When they meet new people, they don't consciously compare, but their body does. Conversations feel flatter. Emotional exchanges feel less precise. The ease they felt with you becomes the unspoken standard, and most connections fall short without anyone knowing why. Psychologically, this happens because you bypass their defensive sorting process. Most people are categorized quickly: safe but boring, exciting but unsafe, attractive but demanding. You didn't fit cleanly into any of those boxes. You brought emotional depth without chaos and autonomy without detachment. And once someone experiences that balance, their system recalibrates. They can't unknow it. What's important to understand is that this doesn't mean they suddenly become capable of healthy attachment. The imprint you leave doesn't automatically heal their avoidance, but it does create dissonance. Their old strategies feel less satisfying. Their justifications feel thinner. They may continue to avoid intimacy, but they do so with a deeper awareness of what they're missing. This is often why avoidants seem to see eye. Are sealed back psychologically, even if they never reach out. They replay conversations. They remember how you responded in moments of vulnerability. They recall how you didn't escalate or withdraw when things got difficult. These memories aren't nostalgic, they're comparative. You become the silent benchmark against which other relationships are measured. There's also a philosophical layer here. Human beings don't just seek pleasure, we seek coherence. We want relationships that make sense at a deep level. With you, things aligned. Words matched actions, emotions matched behavior. There was a congruence that felt stabilizing rather than draining. And coherence, once experienced, is impossible to forget. It becomes part of the internal map. This is why being special to an avoidant doesn't always look like commitment. Sometimes it looks like hesitation, like reverence mixed with retreat. Because when someone ranks you higher than anyone before, the stakes rise. Losing you would hurt more. Failing you would confirm their deepest fear, that they're not built for the kind of connection they secretly value most. So instead of leaning in, they may step back. Not because you were replaceable, but because you weren't. Distance becomes a way to protect the image of you and the fragile sense of self they maintain around it. It's easier to keep you idealized at a distance than to risk falling short up close. If you've ever felt confused by how meaningful the connection felt, contrasted with how little they were able to show, this is the reason. You weren't misreading the bond. You were experiencing a level of emotional ranking they didn't know how to act on. And while behavior matters, and you should never wait in limbo, the internal truth remains. You shifted their internal standard. And that shift doesn't reverse easily. Even if they move on, even if they rationalize the ending, even if they convince themselves they're better off alone, you remain part of their internal architecture, a quiet reminder of what's possible when connection doesn't require self-erasure. And here's the final truth to hold on to. When someone measures every future connection against the way they felt with you, you were never temporary, you were transformational. There is a moment that comes after confusion, after distance, after silence, when you start to question yourself. You replay conversations. You wonder if you were too much, too open, too available, too real. And when an avoidant pulls away, it's easy to interpret their fear as rejection. But that interpretation misses the deeper truth. Their fear is not evidence of your insignificance. It is evidence of your impact. Avoidants don't fear ordinary connections. They fear the ones that reach beneath the surface of their defenses. They fear relationships that expose the gap between how they live and how they long. When their system reacts strongly, when avoidance intensifies rather than fades, it's not because the bond was weak, it's because it mattered enough to threaten their emotional equilibrium. Psychologically, fear is not the opposite of love. Indifference is, Fear only arises when something has value, when there is something to lose. For avoidants, that value creates internal conflict. They feel drawn toward you, while simultaneously fearing the consequences of staying close. And when that conflict becomes too intense, avoidance feels like relief, even though it carries its own kind of pain. This is why the ending or the distancing can feel abrupt and disproportionate. Nothing dramatic happened, no betrayal, no explosion, just a quiet retreat. But internally, something significant was unfolding. You represented a level of emotional closeness that required growth, and growth for some, anyone who has survived by staying contained, feels like standing at the edge of an unfamiliar cliff. Philosophically, this touches a fundamental human dilemma. Change always demands the death of an old identity. Avoidants have built their sense of self around autonomy, emotional restraint, and self-reliance. With you, they glimpsed a version of themselves that could be open, engaged, and deeply connected. But embracing that version would mean letting go of the strategies that once kept them safe. And that loss, even of something limiting, can feel terrifying. So they retreat. Not because you failed to be enough, but because you asked nothing and still revealed everything. Your presence illuminated the parts of them that were underdeveloped, unhealed, or unintegrated. And rather than face that reflection, they turned away from it. That turning away can look like disinterest, but it's closer to self-protection. This is where many people make the mistake of shrinking themselves. They interpret the avoidance as a signal to become less perceptive, less emotionally available, less authentic. But that would be the wrong lesson. Your depth was not the problem. Your clarity was not the problem. Your capacity for connection was not the problem. Those qualities didn't push them away. They activated fear precisely because they were meaningful. There's also something important to understand about timing. Emotional readiness is not a matter of desire alone. It's a matter of nervous system. Capacity. Two people can want the same thing and still be at different stages of regulation and self-trust. You may have been ready to build something real. They may have been encountering for the first time the limits of their avoidance, and those timelines didn't align. But misalignment does not erase significance. If anything, it magnifies it, because people remember the relationships that challenged them more than the ones that comforted them. They remember the moments when they felt on the